Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the system that's shaping our world one book at a time. If you're listening to this, you're probably already plugged in. We live in a world where information moves instantly, images are just everywhere, and our social lives are increasingly conducted across screens. But have you ever paused and realized that so much of your experience, what you see, what you desire, even what you talk about, feels fundamentally secondhand?
Distant, yeah, or polished.
Exactly, polished or just aggressively performative.
Mm.
As though you are constantly watching this highly produced movie of your own existence rather than actually living it directly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's unpack this. That feeling of fundamental detachment, of living life through a glass screen, is exactly the symptom identified by Guy Debord way back in 1967. Our deep dive today is based on his highly influential, foundational, and radically critical text, The Society of the Spectacle.
And it's so important we establish the scope right away. Debord isn't just, critiquing mass media or the excesses of Hollywood.
Right, it's not a book about television.
Not at all. We are examining the spectacle as a total social system. His definition is structural, and it's far-reaching. He states explicitly that the spectacle is fundamentally a social relationship between people that is mediated by images.
That's such a fascinating distinction. It's not just about what you watch, but how the act of watching reconfigures your relationships with other people, with everything.
Precisely. The image is the middleman in our social dealings. The spectacle is a system designed to drive systematic commodification, yes. But more importantly, it creates radical alienation, and it fundamentally shifts perception itself.
So the critique is structural.
It is. It's about the logic of economic and social organization, the plumbing of the modern world, not merely the technological delivery system for entertainment. We are looking at a system of organized appearances that has come to replace authentic life.
So let's start with the revolutionary behind this critique. Who was Guy Debord? He was an incendiary and utterly non-academic figure in post-war Europe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Famous for being a core member of the Situationist International, or SI.
Yeah, and the Situationists were not your typical left-wing political organization. They came out of avant-garde art movements, particularly Dada and Surrealism.
Okay.
But they moved quickly beyond just aesthetics and into radical social critique. They were known for taking the most extreme critical positions during the mid-century, demanding not just reform, but the total transformation of daily life.
They weren't just trying to change policy.
No, not at all. They truly believed that modern society had to be destroyed because it was destroying human experience.
And their timing couldn't have been more prescient. The book was published in November 1967, which is right on the eve of the explosive social confrontations that defined 1968 across Europe and the world.
It's incredible. Debord later observed that the wide circulation the book eventually achieved came precisely because the disturbances of 1968, the massive strikes, student protests, and civil unrest seemed to confirm its central claims.
So life was imitating art, or in this case, theory.
You can say that. He writes in the preface that the uprisings demonstrated the negation of life become visible. It proved the book's accuracy, showing what was already known structurally before the conflicts even erupted.
It gives the book this almost prophetic quality, like a technical manual for why society was about to just explode.
And that's the ambition. The historical context he was analyzing was the definitive arrival of high-stage post-war consumer capitalism. This was a moment when the economy, particularly in the West, had achieved what Debord calls total hegemony.
Total hegemony.
It had successfully transformed the whole environment into a world of the economy. Everything, from our cities to our personal relationships, was suddenly mediated and dictated by economic logic.
That's a massive claim. Why did this particular moment, the 1960s, make this critique so urgent?
Because for the first time in human history, the basic problem of sheer raw survival, which had dominated all previous societies, was ostensibly solved, at least in the developed world.
Right.
Production had become abundant. But instead of this abundance translating into liberation and creativity, it simply created a new, systemic form of deprivation and alienation.
So people were still working these exhausting, meaningless jobs.
Exactly. Only now they were working to afford a flood of increasingly trivial and interchangeable products. The goal shifted from survival to consumption.
And it's critical to note, he was critiquing both sides of the Cold War coin.
Absolutely. He critiqued the Western diffuse commodity capitalism, but he was equally harsh on the totalitarian state bureaucracy of the Soviet East, which he defined as the concentrated spectacle.
So it wasn't a choice between two good systems, but two different forms of spectacular domination.
Yes, both systems demanded passive contemplation and submission to images of power, whether that power was personified by the glorious leader in the East or the glorious commodity in the West.
He wasn't pulling any punches.
Not at all. Debord's aim, he makes clear, was nothing less than the deliberate intention of doing harm to spectacular society. He wasn't aiming for tenure, he was aiming for revolution.
That sets the stakes dramatically high. So for the listener who hasn't encountered the dense philosophical nature of the text, let's distill the central thesis. What is the spectacle at its heart?
In plain language, the central thesis is that modern society has organized itself entirely around images, representations, and accumulated capital that has been turned into a visible, permanent form.
And this social apparatus, the spectacle,
It replaces authentic, lived human experience, transforming social life into a contemplative, passive system that serves only to reinforce and perpetuate economic domination.
and this isn't just a part of society, it is society. Debord calls the spectacle the very heart of society's real unreality.
Right, it's the total justification for the existing system, governing almost all time spent outside the direct act of production itself. It's where we live, breathe, and derive our false sense of purpose.
So let's delve into those core ideas. We've established the foundational definition. The spectacle is a social relationship between people that is mediated by images. To really get this, you have to realize that the spectacle is not just a collection of pictures, but a deep structural mechanism. So if the images are the medium through which we relate, does that mean our relationships are always fundamentally superficial or focused on performance?
In Debord's view, yes. The spectacle isn't merely a technological product. It's a Weltanschauung worldview that has ceased to be abstract theory or philosophy. It's been actualized, translated into the material realm.
So it's real, it's a force.
It becomes an objective force that demands passive acceptance. It communicates this enormous, unchallenged positivity. Everything that appears is good. Whatever is good will appear. The system assures you that if you can see it, it must be real, and if it's real, it must be valuable.
That sounds exhausting and also deeply anxiety-producing, because if only what appears is good, then we're constantly forced to perform the appearance of goodness and success.
That's precisely the next major shift Debord analyzes. He points out that earlier stages of capitalism involved a shift from what you were, your innate identity or social role, to what you had, your property, your possessions.
Okay.
But the spectacle marks an escalation. The present stage entails a generalized shift from having to appearing.
Okay, let's pause there because that's where we live now. What does that look like in practice?
It means that all effective possession, all having, must now derive its ultimate justification from appearances. If you buy a luxury item, its value is negligible until it is photographed, shared, or otherwise visibly demonstrated in the correct spectacular context.
So the possession only matters if it can be perceived by what he calls the lonely crowd?
Exactly. It's the difference between owning a beautiful object and owning a beautiful object that everyone knows you own.
Right.
And here's the paradox that causes the alienation. Individual reality is only allowed to appear in as much as individual reality is not. Your true, messy, unpolished lived experience is a liability. It must be carefully suppressed so that your spectacular, image-driven reality, your curated self, can thrive. You only become real when you successfully participate in the performance of unreality.
So if you spend 2 hours meticulously staging a photo of your perfect, quiet morning routine, that's time spent crafting an appearance that actively masks the reality of the morning, which was probably chaotic and rushed.
That's the perfect illustration. And this leads us directly to the concept of commodity fetishism at a systemic scale. Marx observed that a commodity is mystified. We forget the labor that created it and treat it as if it has an innate magical value. Debord argues the spectacle just perfects this process.
So how does Debord update Marx's idea for the 20th century, for this new era?
The spectacle is the moment the commodity completes its colonization of social life. Commodities are now, quote, all that there is to see. The world we see is a world of the commodity.
That's a heavy line.
It is. The fetishism is perfected because the perceptible world is replaced entirely by images that are superior to that world, which simultaneously impose themselves as eminently perceptible. We don't just worship the object, we worship the image of the object, which is always more perfect than the object itself.
And the economic system is no longer just about production, right? It's about something else now.
No. Now, alienated consumption is added to alienated production as an inescapable duty of the masses. You are not just required to labor to create the product. You're now required to consume to justify the system's continued existence.
Consumption becomes a moral imperative.
Yeah, a way of proving your loyalty to the spectacle.
This sounds utterly exhausting. Where does this endless mandatory consumption lead us, since we established that the problem of basic survival had already been solved?
It leads to this profoundly unsettling concept of augmented survival. Economic growth, which should have solved the problem of basic human survival once and for all, manages to solve it only by endlessly creating new manufactured needs and enshrining deprivation at a higher level.
So we're not dying of hunger, but we are deprived of something else entirely. What is that something?
We are deprived of authenticity and self-determination. Debord suggests we live a life that is technically augmented in terms of objects and security, but we still feel perpetually deprived of totality, of meaning, of connection.
And the spectacle ensures that feeling of lack persists.
It has to. It guarantees that the next commodity or image promises to deliver the satisfaction that the previous one failed to provide. The deprivation is systemic. It's an engineered absence of fulfillment.
That explains why, despite having abundant food, shelter, and information, many people feel fundamentally empty and are constantly chasing the next purchase or the next experience.
It's a sophisticated system of control based on lack. And the psychological cost of this system is separation and alienation. Debord calls separation the alpha and omega of the spectacle, the beginning and the end.
The original separation, of course, being the worker separated from the product of their labor. That's the Marxist root.
Yes, that core remains. This separation leads to the proletarianization of the world, where consistency and communication, the ability to connect ideas and understand the whole, become the exclusive assets of the system's managers.
So the worker creates this massive force.
An independent, enormous force through their collective success. But that success is experienced only as an abundance of dispossession.
Here's where it gets really interesting, concerning the spectator's personal experience of this alienation. What happens when the world is reduced to a series of images we passively consume?
Debord delivers a truly terrifying verdict on modern contemplation. The more he contemplates, the less he lives. The spectator is completely cut off from their own desires, forced to recognize their needs only through the images proposed by the system.
So you're a spectator of your own life.
And you're also the raw material for the spectacle. The spectator feels at home nowhere, because the map of this new world, the spectacle itself, is everywhere. It is the concrete, manufactured experience of alienation.
It's the ultimate loss of agency. The worker creates a system, and the consumer is then imprisoned by the images that system produces.
And finally, we have to understand the spectacle as a form of materialized ideology. It isn't just a belief system like old-school religion or philosophy. It has been successfully translated into the material realm.
Which makes it the acme, the highest point of ideology.
Right. Why? Because it manifests the essence of all ideological systems, the impoverishment, enslavement, and negation of real life.
Can you elaborate on that religious parallel? Because that's a powerful idea.
Debord argues the spectacle acts as a material reconstruction of the religious illusion. In the past, humans would project their collective powers and aspirations onto the heavens, creating gods, divine purpose, a paradise.
Okay.
The spectacle has brought those powers down to earth, finding a place for a fallacious paradise within material life itself.
So instead of praying to God for eternal salvation, we buy a product promising earthly bliss or social status right now. The promise of the perfect eternal life is replaced by the promise of the perfect consumable moment.
Precisely. And this is why the spectacle is so powerful. It preserves the core ideological features of both materialism, where concrete things master social life, and idealism, where an abstract ideal is given material form through signs and signals. It uses the physical abundance of capitalism to deliver the spiritual promises of old religion, thereby achieving total dominance over consciousness.
Now that we have the definitions down, let's map this system. How does the spectacle function as an active, self-reproducing engine, and who are the players keeping the gears turning?
The primary actors are pretty straightforward. You have the ruling order and administrators, those who monopolize the means of communication and organization.
So massive corporations, the whole economic framework.
Exactly. And then the rest of society is functionally reduced to the worker consumer, whose role is essentially passive participation.
And the incentives must be self-perpetuation. It seems like the whole point is just to keep going.
They are entirely self-referential. The system's overarching incentive is not utility or human flourishing, but the continuance of the autonomous economy. Debord notes chillingly that the system's only planned development is itself.
No.
Everything else is secondary, and this continuity is ensured through the ceaseless manufacture of pseudo-needs. The spectacle exists solely to justify the system's aims and conditions, making it an eternal, self-licking ice cream cone of consumption.
And to constantly justify its existence, the spectacle constantly promotes specific narratives, namely, narratives of guaranteed success, endless consumption, and inevitability, always framed as progress, no matter how destructive that progress might be.
And no narrative is more illustrative than the function of stars and celebrities. They're not just famous people, they are spectacular representations of living human beings who distill the banality of the spectacle into images of possible, yet fundamentally inaccessible role.
They embody the ultimate goal of labor without actually having to perform ordinary labor.
Exactly, they mimic power and leisure. They are presented as the glorious final results of social labor, convincing the viewer that the system can produce happiness and power. Just not for them, not yet. They are simultaneously models for identification and unattainable ideals.
That leads naturally to the illusion of false choices. If the spectacle is a catalog of successful lives and desirable objects, it has to offer variety, right?
It does, but the variety is illusory. The system offers myriad roles, objects, and spectacular antagonisms, often tied to phantom qualities. Think of the sheer number of brands of bottled water, or the constant parade of new social media platforms, each promising a slightly different optimized experience.
But they all ultimately serve the same goal: increased passive consumption and attention capture.
Correct. Debord highlights that even seemingly deep conflicts, like the generational antagonism between youth and adulthood, or the endless political skirmishes we see played out, merely characterize the dynamism of capitalism, where it is things that rule.
So the competition itself is the show.
Right. The competition among these conflicting mass-produced fragments creates the illusion of total freedom of choice, all while concealing the unity of poverty, the shared impoverished state of alienation that binds all participants together, regardless of their chosen flavor of spectacular life.
So variety is the method of control, not liberation. And this structure creates powerful feedback loops. The whole system seems designed to reinforce the isolation that it needs to thrive.
Absolutely. The economy is founded on isolation and simultaneously produces isolation. This is the isolation loop. Technology isolates, in turn. Consider how goods like cars and television, and later, personal computers and phones, reinforce the isolation of the lonely crowd.
You're physically alone, consuming images that suggest you are socially connected.
Yes, and that isolation drives you back toward the spectacle. It's the consumption, right arrow, representation, right arrow, increased consumption loop.
A vicious circle.
Totally. Cut off from authentic lived experience, the isolated individual turns back to the spectacle to find validation, instruction on what to want next, and a substitute for genuine communication. Passive acceptance becomes the only remaining social currency.
Debord's most insightful structural mapping, especially for those trying to understand global history, comes from distinguishing between the three historical forms the spectacle takes: concentrated, diffuse, and integrated.
Historically, before 1967, Debord saw a worldwide division. The concentrated spectacle characterized totalitarian, bureaucratic systems, think Stalinism, fascism, or the more rigid state-controlled economies.
Okay.
It focuses on a single, monolithic, imposed image of the good, often centralized in one infallible individual or party ideology.
That system demands constant surveillance and terror.
It does. It's associated with permanent violence and police methods actively transforming perception. The message is simple. If everyone has to be like the leader, it is because there is nothing else to be. Deviation is immediately punishable.
The diffuse spectacle, on the other hand, sounds more familiar to us in the West.
That's the spectacle of commodity abundance in modern capitalism. It's not centralized. It's an apologetic catalog where each commodity and each ideology fights for itself in the marketplace.
So it offers a host of conflicting yet mutually reinforcing spectacular models.
Exactly. You have the environmental model fighting the gas-guzzling car model, the healthy living model fighting the binge-eating model. The choices are endless.
But as we discussed, all are equally trivial.
They are rooted in quantitative triviality. It's an ideological marketplace where freedom is defined only by the quantity of choices available, not the quality of life those choices deliver.
What Debord observed later in his 1988 comments must have been chilling, the rise of the integrated spectacle.
It is the contemporary form, representing a convergence, replacing that former worldwide division. The integrated spectacle is a unified global practice that has successfully transformed the world economically and, crucially, uses police methods to transform perception.
So the soft tyranny of endless choice merges with the hard tyranny of control.
Exactly. It suggests that modern diffuse consumption requires the centralized, passive acceptance and control formerly associated only with concentrated authoritarianism. Think of the seamless, pervasive surveillance and the absolute control over information flow that exists today, combined with the endless pressure to consume and perform.
So the contradictions are managed within the system itself.
Right, creating a unified, total experience of spectacular control.
It is uncanny how well Debord's 1967 concepts map onto our modern reality, particularly when we look at the mechanics of digital life and branding. Let's delve deep into these modern corollaries.
The first place we see this perfected is in advertising and branding culture. Debord argues that the spectacle demands a kind of emotional surrender, an outpouring of religious zeal. Why?
Why?
Because the commodity in abundance simply cannot supply genuine satisfaction via its use value. A phone is just a piece of plastic and wire. Therefore, the satisfaction is sought in the acknowledgement of its value qua commodity.
The value of the iPhone isn't that it makes calls. It's that it signifies status, belonging, and an allegiance to a particular brand ideology.
Precisely. This creates a mystical self-abandonment in honor of the commodity's freedom. The function of the brand is to supply this missing spiritual quality, making the act of consumption feel transcendent, almost religious.
And the constant chase after newness, the fad item, perfectly illustrates this underlying absurdity.
It does. Debord wrote that the sheer fad item perfectly expresses the fact that as the massive commodities become more and more absurd, absurdity becomes a commodity in its own right.
Right. Think of any ephemeral digital trend, a piece of clothing that is only cool for 1 month or a specific limited edition drop.
I remember years ago when people were collecting those trivial, mass-produced plastic toys. The entire exercise was clearly absurd, yet participation was mandatory if you wanted to be in on the cultural conversation.
That's it.
That act of collecting or participating in the fad is described as accumulating the commodity's indulgences, a kind of religious token of the commodity's temporary presence. Reified man proclaims his intimacy and alignment with the spectacle through this submission to the fleeting trend.
This brings us inevitably to social media and curated identity. We discussed the shift to appearing being dependent on not being individually real. Social platforms are the ultimate architecture for this process.
They are. The Instagram or TikTok feed is the hyper-visible construction of an identity predicated on the careful masking of inconvenient or ordinary reality. The spectacular self is optimized for passive consumption by others.
And this consumption of spectacular items, likes, comments, visibility, is pursued as a form of pseudo-gratification.
It's consumption aimed at occupying the center of the social stage, however briefly, as the revelation of the goal of the production process. Look at me, I am successful.
But the core structure guarantees that this prestige quickly evaporates.
Of course. The platform, the spectacle, ensures that as soon as the object or the identity becomes mass-produced or widely copied, its essential poverty stands revealed. Too late, the person who bought the unique item discovers everyone else has it, and the race is already on for the next unique signal.
And structurally, social media perfects the spectacle by elevating the sense of sight.
This is a crucial, subtle point. Debord argued that sight was raised to the special place once occupied by touch, because sight is the most abstract of the senses and the most easily deceived.
And that makes it adaptable to this generalized abstraction.
Right. Digital life is almost purely ocular. It's about the gaze, about appearance, immediately abstracted from the physical context of reality. You cannot touch or smell the perfectly staged meal. You can only look at the idealized representation of it.
Let's shift that gaze to the world of political spectacle and image-based discourse. The spectacle doesn't just sell products, it sells governance.
The spectacular character of power is rooted in the specialization of power. The ruling order takes advantage of this by discoursing endlessly upon itself in an uninterrupted monologue of self-praise. The discourse is circular, constantly referencing its own necessity and success.
And in the diffuse spectacle, the political leader becomes the pseudo-star.
They must possess the full range of accepted human qualities. They must be relatable, yet heroic, humble yet powerful, authentic yet highly scripted.
So they're admirable people who personify the system.
But crucially, they are well known for not being what they seem to be. Their essential political greatness is achieved by embracing a reality lower than that of the most insignificant individual life. They're often profoundly shallow or manufactured, yet they are celebrated for this very managed inauthenticity.
I often think of political rallies or campaign stops today. They feel less like platforms for policy discussion and more like meticulously staged brand activations.
That is the spectacle-consuming politics. The policy itself is reduced to a soundbite, an image of a solution, while the vast majority resources are dedicated to managing the perception and the personal brand of the pseudostar. The image is the message, and the image is fleeting.
Finally, let's address that profound modern sense of disconnection despite connectivity. Debord applied his critique to the material organization of space, particularly urbanism.
Yes. He noted that the spectacle eliminates geographical distance. You can talk to someone across the world instantly, only to create distance internally in the form of spectacular separation. The infrastructure of modern life actively enforces this separation.
How does he connect urban planning to class control?
Debord saw urbanism as the ultimate technology of separation. Historically, when workers were massed together in cities, they posed a revolutionary threat because they could communicate and organize.
So urbanism is designed to atomize workers.
Explicitly. The segregated housing developments, the car-centric infrastructure, the massive separation between work, residence, and culture, it all ensures the isolation of the population has become a much more effective means of control.
The suburb is a spectacular invention designed for the lonely crowd.
Absolutely. The isolation inherent in modern mobility, driving alone, living in segregated zones, is then immediately filled by the spectacle's omnipresent message. You get the tragic reality of individuals isolated together, unable to communicate outside the prescribed channels of the spectacle.
Stepping back, let's view Debord's work through the crisis and perception lens, the lens that looks at how systems dominate individual agency. It seems like the entire book is a case study in systems over individual choice.
It is the defining structure. Debord's analysis shows that this spectacular apparatus is the total justification for the conditions and aims of the existing system. The economy is not merely a component of society. It operates as an autonomous system dominating society.
And individual choices are just internal navigations within that system.
Exactly. Which brand of car to buy or which pseudo-star to vote for, these are merely navigations within a predetermined, non-negotiable reality.
One of the most insidious ways the system dominates is through the repression of authentic time.
This is a huge theme in the book. The spectacle represses any possible alternative use of irreversible time, because genuine historical time where people make decisions about their lives together represents an immediate threat to the passive system.
So the worker creates history, but is denied the ability to live it.
The ruling class constantly denies them the ability to live that time. Instead, time is turned into an abstract, measurable, exchangeable commodity.
And this reveals how ideology becomes lived reality. The spectacle isn't just a philosophy we choose to believe, it is the infrastructure we inhabit.
Right. Ideology, in its material form, remolds the whole of the real to its own specifications. It is no longer a philosophical error. It is the physical and social organization of life itself. The spectacle becomes the guardian of society's bad dream, expressing only society's wish for sleep and perpetual passivity, ensuring no one wakes up to the totality of their alienation.
I find this idea that perception itself is a site of control particularly alarming, especially when we consider the integrated spectacle.
It is terrifying because it moves beyond mere propaganda. The convergence into the integrated spectacle means the system actively uses police methods to transform perception. They don't just censor information, they structure reality so that inconvenient truths are literally unintelligible or invisible to the spectator.
So if I have a personal, genuine experience that contradicts the spectacular narrative, the system works to delegitimize my memory of that experience.
Precisely. Spectacular consumption ensures that individual reality, being cut off, remains bereft of language or concept and is forgotten to the benefit of the spectacle's false memory, the memory of the unmemorable.
And lived experience can't be communicated.
Because the shared language of real communication has been lost, replaced by the standardized vocabulary of spectacular representation.
That makes the system sound completely inescapable, almost driving the individual mad.
Debord found that parallel so strong that he drew a direct connection to psychology. suggesting the pervasive false consciousness imposed by the spectacle mirrors schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia being characterized by a sense of fragmentation and broken reality.
Yes, specifically, citing the psychiatrist Joseph Gabel, Debord notes that schizophrenia is characterized by a degradation of the dialectic of the totality and a degradation in the dialectic of becoming.
So the spectator has only figmentary interlocutors.
The celebrities, the brands, the personas, and subjected to a one-way discourse on commodities. The individual is passive, condemned to accept alien reality, and driven toward madness, entertaining the illusion that they are reacting when they are merely consuming.
It's the ultimate psychological crisis, where the mind is perfectly adapted to the false world at the expense of its own sanity.
It's a totalizing diagnosis of modern life.
So, if the spectacle is the concrete manufacture of alienation, turning human creation against itself, and the economy manufactures pseudo-needs whose only goal is self-perpetuation, what is the alternative? How do we escape this total system?
Debord frames the alternative as a revolutionary act, the radical reclaiming of lived experience. The negation of the spectacle happens when the proletariat, the vast mass of workers excluded from genuine power, realizes its total exclusion from life itself
So they stop demanding better commodities.
and start demanding to live the historical time that they themselves create.
But how does one translate that realization into a political structure? Debord was not interested in typical political parties.
No, his project demanded a total transformation of social organization, specifically through the establishment of workers' councils. These councils, which would be anti-state dictatorships of the proletariat, must vest all decision-making and executive powers in themselves.
So it's a decentralized, self-managed structure.
Yes, and he believed this is the only context where the problems of the revolution can be solved, leading to a generalized historical life.
This means reclaiming time itself, which had been turned into that abstract, exchangeable commodity.
Precisely. The goal is the withering away of the social measurement of time in favor of an individual and collective irreversible time which is playful in character. Play, creativity, and the autonomous creation of daily life replace labor and passive consumption.
A fundamentally optimistic vision hidden inside a terrifying critique.
It is. The revolutionary class must become dialecticians and inscribe their thought upon practice. Theory must join forces with a unified social practice. If we are fighting the spectacle, our critique cannot be spectacular. It cannot use the same passive consumption models.
Right, it has to be different.
It cannot. The revolutionary theory must be carried out in the fluid language of anti-ideology, using the famous situationist method of détournement.
Let's make sure we clearly define that, because it's key to their method.
Détournement means the subversion, deflection, or rerouting of existing phrases, images, or judgments. You take an element of the spectacular system, a slogan, an advertisement, a piece of artwork, and you tear it away from its original context, restoring its potentially subversive qualities or turning its own logic against itself.
So taking a corporate logo or a common advertising jingle and changing it just enough to expose the underlying lie or contradiction.
Exactly. Think of modern meme culture or digital collage art that lampoons corporate messaging. When done effectively, détournement is the only way to expose official spectacular verities by refusing to respect the framework of the spectacle itself. It's the counterlanguage of genuine communication.
This raises a powerful final thought for you, the listener. If Debord suggests that the world already holds the dream of a liberated, playful, and realized historical time, that we all possess the deep potential for authentic life, what practical force, what specific conscious realization is needed to acquire the consciousness to break the glass screen and experience the reality that currently exists only as a dream? The task of our time, according to Debord, is radical: to stop contemplating the representation of life and begin living the totality of our time directly. This deep dive was based on The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord, translated by Donald Nicholson Smith. We encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author's work, or check it out from your local library. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini-explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.